Okay. It is 6:40, so I will call the meeting of the special board meeting to order. I want to declare that we have a quorum for this meeting. Public comments on the agenda items. Anyone wanted to speak?
I want to speak.
Okay. So you have 3 minutes, and then I think if there's clarifying questions, you can ask clarifying questions, but there's not gonna be like a back and forth kind of discussion.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I gave, the village administrator, I gave Boz a copy of this. I gave him 4 copies in case you wanna look at it, but I think the first 2 actually go to the point of the discussion, and I think the handout that I was just recently given, tries to address some of it, but, the real problem is, well, let's start out with number 1. As far as the audit of the firefighters athletic association and your ordinance, 5.13 refers to the fire department donation funds held by the village. That was what I'll give you a little background first of all. I'm a 60+ year resident of the village. I'm no longer a resident. I'm a former fire chief. I retired in 2014, 35 years of service to the village. I grew up less than a block from here, and it's very near and dear to me. Anyhow, back to this, I believe that the audit refers to the donation funds held by the village. It was decided years ago by the village board that any donations that were addressed to the Port Edwards Fire Department would be put in that fund held by the village. I thought it was kind of odd that when they talked about that fund held by the village and being audited, it only mentioned the police, the veterans, and the flags. It didn't mention the fire department fund. I mean, it's been 9 years since I was chief, so I'm not sure if that fund is still in there. I would imagine it is. The next part is, I think the real question is the firefighters association, and maybe the attorney here can help with this point, is it part of the fire department or is it standalone organization? Back in the 80s, the athletic association was, how can I say this? The technical term be it was made, not a nonprofit. I don't know when the nonprofit was done, but it was
An LLC.
Anyhow, they did a legal thing to make it its own standalone organization. Was registered with the state of Wisconsin. I'm not sure the whole part there, but I was a firefighter when it was done. And it was done because of a similar situation to what you have going right now. I think what the village needs to do is figure out whether it is part of the fire department or is it a standalone organization. And if it's a standalone organization, they have no right to audit it, in my opinion. Now, as a nonprofit, there's probably things that maybe they aren't doing that they need to do. I would say that to make it more public and more open. But I can tell you at the dance, at least in the past, when people write a check out or make a donation, they're asked to make it out to the Fire Department Athletic Association. If they make it out to the fire department, it should be deposited here with the village. That's separated. So let's say Urkel makes a donation to the fire department, that would go to the village. Unless they specifically make it to the athletic association. I just wanted to clear that up, because I think that's kind of the sticking point on this whole thing. There's board members that believe that it's part of the fire department, and it's a very gray area. I'll grant that, because the firemen at the dance wear their shirts and their badges. We decided to do that years ago to kind of keep the peace. You see all these people with badges walking through the crowd, it kind of tends to to, keep fights and anything like that down, and control those types of situations. When they do the brat fry during the village rummage sale, they give tours of the fire station. They show the kids the fire trucks, they do fire safety stuff, they do all different kinds of things. So there's a fundraiser going on, and at the same time, there's a village function to it. I guess my next point is, it seems like a terrible time to be attacking the fire department. They're at half strength. They're struggling to keep enough people. They're at all-time high for calls. It's extremely challenging, and it's not just here, it's all over the state of Wisconsin. So when these people that you're trying to get to volunteer see all this commotion going on and all this back and forth, it gets even harder to get these people to sign up. The other thing I'd like to point out is these fundraising events aren't just fundraising events, they're village events that bring people into the community. I was in a meeting earlier here where you talked about bringing people into the community. They bring a lot of people into the community. As a matter of fact, the second year that we had the dance, we thought about not doing it anymore because it was so much work. And the reason we kept doing it was because it was a community event. And the people really responded to it. A lot of other events in the village failed, but that one people really seemed to like. Get a little long-winded here, but
We're over the 3 minutes, but I'll give you a little bit to wrap up here.
okay. I guess the last thing I want to do is I want to support Chief Warden. Really a thankless job, and this has made his job much more difficult. So I ask you to really, if you guys can figure out these first two, the rest of it should just fall into place. If they are actually part of the fire department, then they need to change on their end. I don't believe that's the case. So anyhow, I'd like to say, I'd like to see this brought to a conclusion sooner than later. The chief was threatened with disciplinary action. That is completely wrong. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. So we've done before the discussion with the village attorney on Firefighter Athletic Association issue and the village engagement moving forward. This is an effort to gather data from the subject matter experts to make a possible future decision by the board. I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, basically, you have a statement from my correspondence with Nick, you have the statement from our auditor, and you have a memo that I crafted that they've both seen and commented on. You've heard enough from me, and I guess you asked for Nick to be present to ask direct questions to. The auditor is available, but if you see the first line, it says it, in his opinion, it's a legal issue that needs to be sorted. It's not an auditor issue. So that's why you're here.
May I ask
Yeah.
a question? Madam President, I guess, as I think that the former chief pretty eloquently pointed out, there's some gray area here and even some gray area in terms of my understanding. So I guess, my question would be, what is the formal name of the Athletic Association? And can I find it on the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions? Because if it is a separate entity, that's been filed as such with DFI, it should be there. And so I just don't know. I guess I'm not sure what name precisely to look for. We could probably find it right now while I'm here at the meeting.
I probably got the tax statement and
So that's
we're the Port Edwards Firefighters Athletic Association. We are a 501c3.
okay.
NEDIN, and we do have a tax exempt number and everything.
Okay. So I guess the way, as you can see from, if I may, Madam President, I'm just kind of, as you can see from Mr. Troutman's response, there really is an issue with wanting to audit an entity that's completely separate from the village. Because you don't audit, first of all, an audit is a fairly invasive process. It's common for the village, of course, the village is audited regularly. The police department, the fire department should be audited. Other departments that do these things, that manage money, that have made purchase decisions and so forth, it's not unusual for audits to take place. Or some form, call it an audit, call it whatever you want, but a separate entity, that, I guess the question is, does the village have authority over this entity to do that? The answer is probably not, if it's a separate entity, which then raises the question of, to what extent should the village and the athletic association be intertwined in terms of what they do? Right? And so, this is why I mean, on the basis of what I know, it seems to me that if we're talking about dealing with a 501c3, and there's going to be, there's going to be nonprofit funding for an organization that's part of the village. I mean, I think clearly there's some circumstances, and again, as the former chief pointed out, where I think we need to sort out whether there are conflicts of interest under certain circumstances, right? Because conflict of interest, when we're talking about employees, trustees, and so forth, if there's any financial benefit, for example, I don't know, I mean, without an audit, whether the athletic association pays anybody who's on the board. And so, I mean, again, I presume that they don't, based on just my experience, what little I know about it. But that would be an example of something that would potentially be a conflict of interest. But I think more importantly is that, if the village doesn't have any authority over it, and the village has no oversight beyond the decision as to how to interact with it, and the village is separately managing and funding the fire department, then a separate 501c3 designed to support the fire department is something the village can support, but that should be kept at arm's length legally in terms of how it's handled. I mean, it should be handled like a separate entity. It shouldn't be something that sort of is funded the same way that funding is determined for the fire department. The village should be, in my view, to keep separation and to eliminate any necessity. Well, I shouldn't say necessity. Eliminate any requirement or perception that there is a requirement of an audit, which again, an audit's expensive. I mean, any kind of an audit is expensive. Now, can the village look at a nonprofit that it's operating in conjunction with in certain ways and say, hey, we'd like some information about how you're spending this money. Where is it going? Or we'd like some information about how you, what your processes or procedures are, because the village will only work with organizations that do X, Y, or Z. Though with the presumption that X, Y, Z are reasonable. Yeah, you can do that, but I think that's something that shouldn't be ad hoc. I think that's something that should be more procedural, so that there's no perception of either favoritism or retaliation. And so that I think is something that needs to be addressed. I mean, perhaps by public safety, perhaps by FHR. I mean, I think there are a couple of different committees. I would leave it to you, Madam President, to kind of decide maybe, or at least propose perhaps where that goes. But otherwise, my view is that if the organization is going to be a separate organization, the village should deal with it in exactly the same way that it deals with any other nonprofit organization that it works with, which is to say, again, keep it at arm's length, the same benefits, the same costs, the same requirements are put on the athletic association that other organizations have. And that way there's it's a complete. That way there's no issues with that sort of thing. And the only thing I think we need to sort out is, of course, because naturally, there's gonna be firefighters that are involved in it, right? I mean, I think that there's an expectation. It would be, I mean, it wouldn't be unusual, but it'd be. I mean, I don't know, it wouldn't be impossible, but it would be weird if there was an athletic, firefighters athletic association in a village of 700 some odd people that had none of its firefighters, none of the village firefighters on it, participating in it and supporting it. And I think the expectation would be that they shouldn't necessarily be barred from doing that. I think the problem comes in when there's common control between the two, and where there's financial decisions that might be made in this room or in this building that affect how financial decisions are going to impact the fire department, either directly or indirectly. So that's kind of where, I mean, that's where my recommendation kind of or my initial thought on a initial recommendation came to Boz on whatever page. Page 1 of, which is actually page 5 or 6, you know what I mean? But the email there saying that it's better to keep it separate. I just don't agree that, like, I agree with Mr. Troutman that it's just not, like, the village shouldn't be directing what nonprofit organizations do. If the village were to create a village controlled organization whose job is raising funds from the community for the fire department, then obviously it should be audited. Obviously, the village should know where every cent goes all the time. And obviously, there would be no, then there would be no external, there'd be no external separation. There'd be preferential treatment perhaps, but additional requirements in terms of transparency, open records and so forth. But that's also, it's also complicated. That's also difficult to deal with in terms of the financials and for Mr. Troutman as well. And I think it also creates, there are some circumstances in which it probably makes conflict of interest issues more difficult to manage. So I guess that's a lot that I'm throwing out there, but Boz, is there anything that you think I missed or that I should discuss in more detail before anyone has questions for me about the.
No, you hit on the key points, that the separation, the need for separations.
Madam President, can I just add one comment?
We're just gonna keep this on the table for right now and have our trustees ask questions first.
So Nick, are you suggesting that we completely separate financially? They would pay to use the building. We wouldn't pay them for setup, breakdown, no LOSA points, separate the finances of all of that?
Well, I guess how does the village do it with other nonprofits? I mean, if it's the common village practice to make village facilities available to nonprofit organizations free of charge, and that's the standard, then I see no reason to apply that to the Firefighters Athletic Association as well. But if their village is charging for various things, then that should either be, it should either be charged or it should be considered essentially a donation in kind to the, as part of the, whatever donating or funding the village is deciding independently to send to the athletic association.
So what about the pay for, unless the pay for setup, the pay for breakdown, the LOSA points?
I'm not sure specifically what you're referring to. I mean, how so I guess, is there as far as that, like setup, breakdown and so forth, how is that normally handled by the village in terms of dealing with that?
We pay for the meeting in June. It's a business meeting. That's what we pay for as a village. After that meeting, the firefighters end the meeting and they go about and do start setup. But we do not pay, chief, you chime in, we do not pay for the Friday, the Saturday tear down, we don't pay that at all.
So that's changed because it was in the bylaws that way.
It's written in the bylaws, but it's never been executed.
I'm the secretary, I don't pay none of that.
Yeah, but it is in the bylaws, you're correct, and we're changing that language, working through the bylaws, yeah.
So then the LoSA points,
It is an unpaid point, but yeah, that's the village's determination, they don't want that to be, there ain't gonna be anyone here on the fire department not making their lowest point because they didn't get a point for setting up the dance.
You wanna start going local, then we do cleanup at, Memorial and Rapid. I can get a point either, can be paid. I mean, where you wanna start? That's my question, you know, the firemen are coming under the clean department.
Whatever. Okay, we're gonna keep this conversation on table for now, and then we can have that discussion either at public safety or FHR. Tier, do you have anything else?
No.
For Nick? Okay. Does anybody else have anything for Nick?
So to make clarification on the bylaws, everything that was written in there, that being a draft that we just created. Through the years, we've had a lot of chief's discretion when it comes to pay and not pay for certain activities. So we had sat down with the leadership of the fire department a couple of years ago to make it in black and white on what you're gonna get paid for and what you're not gonna get paid for. So then that takes the discretion of the chief off and quits showing favoritism for certain things. Because there has been instances in the past where certain people got paid for certain things, but others didn't. So we just wanted to list everything. Now, that being a draft, that was all supposed to be talked about, and we haven't talked about it yet, unless you did in the last month. But there was things on there, there was a section of things that we're getting paid for and things that we're not getting paid for. And so all the fundraising things should not be paid for, brat fries, setting up, Lions Club picnics, stuff like that.
I mean, if it's, again, well, I guess it depends. I mean, if you're talking about doing it for a separate entity, then I think that's the issue, is if the village, I mean, if the village is indirectly paying for it and it's on village time. I think this is where some of the gray area has come in, right? Where people, if, you know, when is somebody, I mean, is there a separation between the time when you're on village time and you're on nonprofit time? And if there isn't one, then, I mean, then that's how it ought to be. Now, if the village wants to, if in support of the association wants to make whatever form of a donation and that it might be, and it ends up, you know, covering some of those costs, then perhaps the village wants to do that. But I think it has to be explicit, and I think it's got to be separated, because otherwise you have this issue where, I frankly, I think that's where kind of a lot of it arises, is that there's I think just confusion about that sort of thing. Like, it's hard, I mean.
The only thing that happens on village time that somebody's getting paid for is the public works crew delivering picnic tables to the parking lot. Otherwise, everybody else is 100% volunteer.
Okay. I mean, yeah, and I think that just keeping those things separate solves the issue, at least as far as that's concerned. And that's probably the only thing that, if that hasn't been addressed in the bylaws and there's still some ambiguity about it before the bylaws are changed, it should be made, it should be addressed one way or another.
First of all, does anybody else on the table have questions for Nick about this? Okay. Is there any objection to going off table here? Did you sign in?
I just have a question. So like on the bylaws, we have it combined, and we have some of the association bylaws, just in our bylaws, they should be separate. I mean, now we're discussing this, I mean, to moving them over to like, the events that the association has, we should have a bylaw and what we buy and what we.
Yes, well,
Right now, it's all in one, and I think we have to look at the draft, we got the draft from the village. I think we have to separate that, and I think that's what we're gonna do.
well, let me be clear, first of all, I can't give the association legal advice.
No,
But in terms of the fire department.
correct.
It is, yes, that would be, there shouldn't be overlap. Well, look, the bylaws could look similar for a variety of reasons, right?
Mhm.
But there shouldn't be overlap in responsibility and, authority between the fire department bylaws and the association bylaws. It's, again, I think it's natural, probably almost unavoidable, that to a certain extent, there's some working hand in hand on some things. But I think that for there to be association bylaws, like what are basically de facto association bylaws as part of the fire department bylaws, that's, and I'm, you know, not gesturing anyone in particular, but y'all, you know what I mean? So, that I think creates a, again, it creates like a common control that I think is an issue. So, and generally, I mean, conflict of interest principles, generally speaking, like in business and so forth, are a lot of times based on common control. You know, do the same entities, the same people have authority over it? And then is there some benefit to the one because of their direct benefit because of their association with the other? So I don't, and again, that way, the association should have its own bylaws, and the fire department obviously has its own bylaws. And if they're similar, fine, but they shouldn't be the same document or taken from them.
That's what trustee Saylor said with how it's written for like setup and stuff, where it's not paid, that shouldn't even be in the village fire department bylaws at all. It should be in the association one.
I mean, it should probably say something as simple as, any, volunteer time.
It's not paid.
That anytime that firefighters volunteer, for an outside nonprofit is not paid time by the department. And that probably, I mean, again, without seeing, you know, and going through the language, that probably goes a long way towards settling it to have something along those lines right there, as far as that goes.
Okay. Quickly.
It's very short, but, in the past, any donation to the fire department by anybody or the athletic association to the fire department, let's say we wanna put some equipment on a truck or wanted to or whatever, that all had to be approved by the village board. They had to accept that donation. So you have control of what the athletic association is doing as far as the money they give to the village. You can accept it or reject it. That all came from the Jaws of Life years ago. It was donated to the village, which resulted in a lot of calls and more expense to the village. And they put that in place back then. So you do have control, and most of the money does go for equipment to the fire department. Not all of it, but most of it does. So.
Thank you.
I only need 30 seconds.
Okay.
2 quick points. If it's easier on the village to have us rewrite a 501c3 and get the name Court Edwards out of it, and let's call it a Firefighter Athletic Association. Point 2 is that's what everyone else is doing, I didn't get rid of all this stuff. Because I mean, if that's what you think we're representing is for whatever it's fire department. And the other point being, if the dance is gonna be held there and you guys want us to, you know, pay for electricity, pay for the building, that type of stuff, or write it over as a donation to us, that obviously all have to be in writing. And then we'll just determine whether we have our dance at our fire department or we go somewhere else with it.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else, anything? So can you just have like a 10-second, like what is your suggestion, biggest suggestion that we have to do?
Well, I guess, for one thing, I think it's pretty clear that
Separation.
yeah, well, there has to be, the bylaws have to be clear, about the separation. I think that's a big part of it, because if the bylaws don't provide for separation, then, I think that creates the issue, in a lot of ways. And then the ordinances just need to reflect that as well. There are a couple of places in the ordinances where, again, there's this sort of implication that there's that it's all tangled up together. And again, this isn't what the suggestion isn't meant to do is say that there shouldn't be any like association or type of affiliation with, the athletic association. And it's not, like, the fact that it's, has Port Edwards in the title, or is intended to, primarily or even exclusively benefit the Port Edwards Volunteer Fire Department, is not, like, that doesn't create legal issues, because it's clearly for a public purpose, it clearly meets 501c3 requirements. The key is that if there's going to be, if it's going to be a nonprofit purpose for people donating, and the nonprofit's going to support the fire department, and there's going to be separation of the finances, then there has to be, I think there's gotta be, actual walls in place of separation. And then just, again, have everything in writing is, I mean, I'm a lawyer, obviously that's good advice. You know, I'm not gonna say that that's a bad idea, because it's not. It's a good idea just to make everything clear. And then, you know, and again, let's be honest. Like, just to,
A little background music for you.
Sorry. I was, am I being played off? Is that-
Yes.
So, well, I guess what I was gonna say is that,
We'll start with those.
I think it's, there's obviously, I think maybe some question about, you know, I don't know. Is there, like, is every dollar accounted for, and is there something wrong with that? You know, I don't know the answer to that. But I think when you look at, does it make sense for the village to be chasing the athletic association around with audits on a consistent basis, to be spending a lot of village time and resources doing that? And creating a situation where there's a lot of, I mean, let's be honest, personality conflicts and, you know, just sort of unnecessary fights taking place over it. Keeping it separate legally and and financially. And having a very clear rules about how the support happens, so that the fire department is able to be supported without there being an issue on this. And then the village can decide, okay, you know, to what extent, if we feel like there's a concern about something, then we can, you know, speak with with the village purse, more or less, or ask questions. And if we don't feel like they're getting answered, well, then you can make the decision about whether or not money goes there or not. And the same way the athletic association can make decisions about whether or not to, you know, support the fire department in certain ways, or whatever the case may be. But I think it's better for it to do it this way. I realize this isn't 10 seconds, I apologize. But I think it's better to do it that way, because the rules are clear. And then the responsibilities are clear. And then the different actors involved look out for themselves and for the way they relate to one another, instead of having to police everybody else in a weird way that somebody may have thought was a good idea to do it this way, but clearly doesn't work on a practical level and creates legal and conflict of interest problems all over the place. So, short version, fix the bylaws, fix the ordinances, put things in writing, and, you know, work together, but be separate.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody have anything else? I know it's a lot of information. No? Okay. Then, without any objection, I will call the meeting adjourned at 7:13. Good.
This is would be a meeting, because it's after a board meeting and not before. I talked about it before.
We'll get a sheet, May 9th, and this meeting will be listed on there, just make sure somewhere you circle that, or, you know, I think that's you guys. Candidate.
So I think the next board meeting, Diane will give you a sheet. And then on circle what meetings. As your committees that you were required to go